All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Debra Medina is our guest. She is a candidate for governor, Republican Party. Her website, www.medinafortexas.com, and the phone lines are open, 1-866-895-6442, if you'd like to talk to Debra. Debra, I'm looking at your schedule of events. I was going to see where you're going to be in our listening area, and the next thing coming up appears to be well, you've got a meeting in Austin, but then on the 29th, you're at the Fort Worth Gun Show.
Well, actually, we've got a bunch of supporters that are at the Fort Worth Gun Show. I'm in Austin all weekend. There's a sovereignty or secession rally in Austin, and a lot of folks very concerned about the overreaching arm of the federal government, and so I'll be there with them, and we'll have a bunch of supporters at the gun show as well in Fort Worth. We'll be back in Fort Worth on September 12th for their big 9/12 rally and event there.
Well, this just brings to mind, so many people call this program and say, since Obama's been president, I can't find ammo at Walmart. I go to Walmart. I went to Walmart the other day to buy some shells, and they were out. And I asked the clerk, I said, anything ominous about this? He says, no, we're just out. There's a lot of people that think our Second Amendment rights are going to be abridged. If you were elected governor of the state of Texas, Debra, is there anything you could do to make sure that our right to bear arms, to be able to buy ammunition under the Second Amendment is protected in the state of Texas?
Well, and that's something I've been talking about a lot. I really believe that the essential elements of freedom are private property ownership and gun ownership, and that there should be no compromise and no surrender on either one of those two things. We've talked a good deal about what then does the state do. We've got two real methods with which to check the overreaching federal government. The executive branch, the governor's bully pulpit, if you will, the Attorney General's office within the executive branch going through the federal courts to stop that overreach. And then I think we need to use the legislature. We'd like to see the legislature as active as possible using a provision called nullification, which we haven't talked about a lot in Texas, but Montana has recently used nullification to stop the real ID process in their state. I think it's a provision that Jefferson talked about quite a bit. He understood that the federal government would overreach, and the states had that method to prevent that. So we're going to be working with state representatives and senators to look at the kinds of legislation that need to be adopted in this next session to stop that overreach. I know there's a lot of concern about some of the arms and gun limitations that are likely to come out of Washington, especially from this administration.
I want to ask you about the Texans' sovereignty or secession rally, the We Texans sovereignty or secession rally. Perry took a little heat in the national media, especially on MSLIB, for this, talking anything at all about secession. What do you think we should do there? If the United States becomes so polarized that you start at San Diego and you go all the way up the West Coast and around through Chicago on down to D.C. and Philadelphia and New York, and all that's liberal, and the part in the middle is more traditional conservative America, how are we going to keep this country together?
Well, I think that we have to realize Texas is a huge state. We say that all the time, and I think we think in terms of geography, but even in terms of economics, we've got the 13th largest economy in the world. When the state of Texas stands up and says we're going to nullify that law and it's not going to have effect in our state, we protect our state. That's the job of the elected officials in Austin, to ensure a republic here in Texas and to do everything that we can to get that federal government to recognize its own constitutional authority and to limit it. I hope we see a strong working relationship developing between Texas congressional delegation and them really championing and leading on these ideas. We've got this flawed logic flowing through our society that seems to think if it's good, government ought to do it, and that's the farthest thing from the truth. You know, churches, communities, and families ought to be doing good. Government ought to be ensuring justice.
Debra, when you talk about these types of things, it takes you back to the Constitution. Obama's appointed, 30-some-odd czars now that are outside.
Incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, outside the Constitution. I mean, the government's looking at nationalizing health care. We're in 2 wars right now that were never declared. Do you remember the Constitution when we still had one and when we still adhered to it? And as governor of Texas, is there anything you could do to bring back the Constitution?
Well, I've got it right here. You know, it's here at my desk. I refer back to it frequently, and we're going back even to the Texas Constitution, to the 1875 version, and looking at what did our early founders, because certainly we've had multiple constitutions in Texas, but the one that we're currently working under goes back to about 1875, and looking at that one and watching the progression of how it's changed over time to see what the original intent was. My campaign has CD-ROMs that we distribute at every event that has the Texas Constitution on it as a reference for people. I think absolutely, there's truth in that. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, and we've got to, go back to the rules. In healthcare, I do that a lot. I've been in health administration for quite some time, and there's lots of regulations in healthcare, and if you don't go back to the regulation itself and look at the written word, it's kind of like that game of telephone, by the time the surveyor comes in, they're so far from what the intent of the original provision was that providers end up paying a lot of money they don't have to, and I think the same is true in government. We need to constantly go back to our Constitution, whether it's the state Constitution or the U.S. Constitution.
All right, let's take a phone call, Deborah, if we can. And let's go to Kevin in Odessa, Texas. Kevin, you're on with Debra Medina.
Well, thank you, sir. Good morning to the both of you. And Ms. Medina, I was noticing in the news here recently the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives have been telling the states that have been passing the Firearms Freedoms Act that it's not recognized that federal law trumps state law. What would you have to say about that agency overstepping its bounds when it comes to state law? And I'll take my answer off the air.
Kevin, I think we've seen a number of pretty successful fights lobbied and led by the Texas Attorney General's office. We have some very capable attorneys there, and I believe that most of us would see the constitutional authority there for the state to stand sovereign in those areas, and we would defer to and champion, I guess, a fight through the Attorney General's office on those issues. I know Texas is already standing with other states prepared to get involved in that very battle.